Welcome back to the whole Bible series. This week we're going through the book of 2 Samuel. So 2 Samuel, or Shmuel, is part of the former prophets in the Tanakh. In our Bible, it is part of the Old Testament historical books. 2 Samuel is the story of King David coming to power as the chosen one by Yahweh. 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book called Shmuel in the Tanakh that cover the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. And for that reason, in the Septuagint, they're called First and Second Kingdoms, continued on by Third and Fourth Kingdoms, which we know as First and Second Kings. For more information on this, go back to episode 10. 2 Samuel is the 10th book of the Old Testament, or of the Bible. So who wrote 2 Samuel and when? So Hebrew tradition actually holds that Samuel was the writer of Shmuel, or 1st and 2nd Samuel. But because of Samuel's death in 1st Samuel, Samuel could not have authored 2nd Samuel. Again, for more information, go back to episode 10. Samuel's broken up into 4 sections. When we left off in 1st Samuel, King Saul had died, and the Israelites were still kind of struggling, coming out of the period of Judges and into the period of having a king. While God had told them to be set apart, they really wanted to be like the nations around them. So they had demanded the king. God had provided that king in Saul, one that he knew that they would accept, but he turned out to be a bad king. And so we kind of left off in a stage of limbo when there is no king. So here's the timeline here. 2 Samuel covers approximately 1010 to approximately 970 BC. First section, chapter 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. Remember, this is where he was staying with the Philistines to be safe from Saul. Verse 2. And on the 3rd day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. David said to him, "Where do you come from?" He said to him, "I have escaped from the camp of Israel." And David said, "How did it go? Tell me." And he answered, "The people have fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead, and Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead." Then David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" And the young man who told him said, "By chance I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. When he looked behind me, he saw me and called to me, and I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered, I am an Amalekite. And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to you, my lord." Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them, and so did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son, and for the people of the Lord, and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. So a couple things here. You see Ziklag and Mount Gilboa highlighted in different colors. That's in concordance with the map here, so you can see the different locations. So the battle was up at Mount Gilboa, which is up in the north. And so this person then traveled all the way down to Ziklag to meet with David. Also highlighted here, it says then David took hold of his clothes and tore them. So tearing your clothes, putting on sackcloth, and throwing ashes on yourself, these were all external signs of mourning. And so David is showing a sign of mourning here. One other thing, in the end of 1 Samuel, it says that Saul killed himself with the sword, and then his arms bearer killed himself also after Saul had died. This seems to contradict that a little bit, but it could just mean that Saul wasn't fully dead, and so this man here, the Amalekite, helped finish him off because Saul was dying. So David then laments over Saul and Jonathan, and we get to chapter 2. After this, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to any of the cities of Judah?" And the Lord said to him, "Go up." David said, "To which shall I go up?" And he said, "To Hebron." So David went up there, and his 2 wives also, and Ahinoam of Jezreel, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. So stop here real quick. The men of Judah, we're talking about the elders, the leaders of Judah, came and anointed David king over the house of Judah. So now he has been anointed king over Judah. But remember that this does not encompass all of Israel. Judah is simply the tribe of Judah, which may encompass Simeon as well. All right, let's go to verse 8. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ish-bosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And he made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all of Israel. Ish-bosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David. And the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So let's stop there real quick. So obviously Saul and 2 or 3 of his sons were killed in battle. That makes this obvious that Ish-bosheth, another one of his sons, obviously had stayed behind. And so Abner's obviously has survived the battle. He comes and grabs Ish-bosheth and takes him over to Mahanaim, and there makes him the next king of Israel. Moving on, we see that Abner and Joab, who's David's commander, end up fighting with their men in Gibeon. And then we get to chapter 3. There was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. So we see that Ish-bosheth is ruling what we call later on the northern tribes. So all of Israel minus the southern tribes of Judah and Simeon. Here, later on, Benjamin would be added to that. But we see that David continues to grow stronger. Him and his armies continue to grow stronger, while Ish-bosheth and his armies continue to weaken. Verse 6. While there was war between the house of Saul and the house of David, Abner was making himself strong in the house of Saul. Now Saul had a concubine whose name was Rizpah, the daughter of Aiah. And Ish-bosheth said to Abner, "Why have you gone in to my father's concubine?" Then Abner was very angry of the words of Ish-bosheth and said to him, "Am I a dog's head of Judah? To this day I keep showing steadfast love to the house of Saul your father, to his brothers and to his friends, and have not given you into the hand of David. And yet you charge me today with a fault concerning a woman. God do so to Abner, and more also, if I do not accomplish for David what the Lord has sworn to him, to transfer the kingdom from the house of Saul and set up the throne of David over Israel and over Judah from Dan to Beersheba." And Ish-bosheth could not answer Abner another word because he feared him. So here we have Abner doing something we're going to talk about a little bit later in this episode. But Abner takes for himself one of the concubines of Saul. In doing so, he's portraying himself as the dominant male figure. So the king then sees this as a challenge to his throne, and he confronts him. But Abner, whether because of his pride or some other reason, gets very upset at Ish-bosheth for doing this, and then threatens that he's going to go away from the house of Saul and actually help David become king over all of Israel. So Abner then goes down and makes a covenant with David to bring him the kingship. And he goes and he reminds all the elders of Israel that God had promised to make David king over all of Israel. So he's going around and basically campaigning for David with the elders. But then something happens. Joab murders Abner to avenge for his brother's death. Earlier on, Abner had killed one of Joab's brothers, and so Joab murders Abner to avenge for his brother's death. And David is very upset about this, and he mourns Abner's death. Not long later, Ish-bosheth is actually murdered. And we get to chapter 4, verse 4. Jonathan, the son of Saul, who had a son who was crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came to Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And as she fled in her haste, she fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth. So we see Ish-bosheth just dies. So that makes Mephibosheth the rightful person that could claim the throne of Saul. If we're going by bloodlines rather than what God had told David, Mephibosheth is in line for the kingship now that Ish-bosheth is dead. And we're going to see how David deals with him here shortly. The elders of Israel then come to David and they agree, and they anoint him king over all of Israel. Chapter 5, verse 1. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led us out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be a shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over all of Israel. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So we're coming to the end of David's time at Hebron, and so we're talking a little bit in the future, flash forwarding here, or foreshadowing about Jerusalem here at the bottom. We come to the second section of 2 Samuel. So David now begins as king of Israel to show his military might. He has all the tribes unified, and he takes his army and they go and they conquer the Jebusites at Jebus. Now Jebus is what we know as Jerusalem, and actually it may have been known as Jerusalem prior to the Jebusites being there, when it was then called Jebus. And we know this from some extra biblical texts referring to Jerusalem that are prior to David's time there. And also we have a clue if we go back to the time of Abraham here on the left in the box. When we met, if you remember, we met Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem, which means the king of peace. This was a city called Salem, or peace, that later becomes known as Jerusalem, so the city of peace. So the Jebusites had taken over, and I don't remember whether this city was fortified prior to them being there or if they fortified it, but they are dwelling and owning this whole land around Jerusalem. And none of the tribes have been able to get them to leave or to eliminate them as they came in and conquered the land. And so now David takes his men and they go and they conquer Jerusalem. All right, there's a little note here going further about the name of Jerusalem here at the bottom. It says it is possible that the name is a compound name deriving from Yara, or pillar, and Shalem, or Salem, which means peace. And so the definition could be either the foundation of the god of Solomon or the foundation of peace. And so David and his army come in and they sneak in through the water cistern and they conquer the city. And so now David and his men rule Jerusalem. And so they set up their city in Jerusalem. This is now their capital city, their fortified city. And David continues with his military campaigns. So we see next, David and his army defeat the Philistines in the valley of the Rephaim from Geba to Gezer, which you can see in the map here to the left. Just a point of note, remember going back, we talked about the Rephaim before. The Rephaim were known as descendants of the giants, or descendants from the Nephilim. And so this is an area of importance because this is showing that David is not only conquering areas in Canaan, but he is once again defeating God's enemies, defeating the giants. Then David retrieves the ark. Remember, the ark was left at Kiriath Jearim when the Philistines brought it back. So David retrieves the ark and eventually brings it to Jerusalem. And then we get to God making his covenant with David. So this is God reiterating that same covenant that he had with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And he reiterated through Moses. And now God's going to give David that same covenant with a little bit more. So let's look at chapter 7. Now, when the king lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, "See now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." And Nathan said to the king, "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, "Go and tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day, but I have been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd the people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? Now, therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off your enemies from before you. And I will make for you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel and plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord, Yahweh, will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I shall establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. When he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the sons of men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, and as I took it from Saul, whom I put away before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. In accordance with all these words, in accordance with all this vision, Nathan spoke to David. So a couple things I want to see here. God is reiterating that he has done all these things for David. This has all been according to his plan, and he's the one that's been moving, and he's the one been establishing this new kingdom. And while David wants to build God a house for his ark, for his footstool, what God wants to do is to build a house for David. And this verse 11 here, where it says, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. That's not saying that God's going to build him a house out of cedar. He already has that. He doesn't need that. But what God's going to do is establish his house forever. And so God promises that he's going to set up David's son on the throne forever. And this is both literal and figurative, which we'll find out later. But God's saying that he's going to establish the throne of his son, the future king, forever, and that son is the one who will build God a house. And then lastly, we see here at the bottom of verse 16 that God is just reiterating that David's throne will be established forever. There's a note here on the left in the box from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. This is what it says. It was not God's will for David to build him a house. Instead, God would build a house for David. God had called David from inauspicious beginnings to be a shepherd of God's people. The house to be built for David would be a royal house, a dynasty of kings. It would originate with him, but would never end. The kingdom and its throne would be permanent, a realm over which the son of David would reign forever. So that's as far as we're going to foreshadow right now. I want to try to stick to the Old Testament as much as possible. So we're going to go ahead and move on. So then we get a vision of David as a good king. So David then praises Yahweh for his blessings and his covenant. And David goes on and defeats the Philistines and the Moabites and the Zobites and the Syrians, the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Amalekites. And we see that David continues to build this kingdom out in the promised land as God has promised them. All right, and so we see chapter 8, verse 15 says that, so David reigned over all Israel, and David administered justice and equity to all his people. So not only was David doing what God had called him to, but he was a fair and good king. Just a reminder here on the bottom, going back to our episodes on Genesis, here's a quote from Genesis 15. It says, on the day the Lord had made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I will give this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites. And so this map here on the right is what we had looked at before. This is the land that God had promised approximately to the Israelites. And in contrast to that, or excuse me, not in contrast, but in comparison to that, we see on the left here, this is the area that David is actually ruling, that he's conquered these areas. And this is the area that Israel is now ruling. So very similar to the footprint that we saw in the promise given to Abraham, from the brook of Egypt all the way up to the Euphrates, and from the sea over into the territories of Moab and Ammon. We get to chapter 9. Verse 1, and David said, is there anyone left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now there was a servant in the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, are you Ziba? And he said, I am your servant. And the king said, is there not still someone of the house of Saul that I may show kindness of God to him? Ziba said to the king, there is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in the feet. Verse 6, and Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David and fell on his face and paid homage. And David said, Mephibosheth. And he answered him, Behold, I am your servant. And David said to him, Do not fear, for I will show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore to you all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always. And he paid homage and said, What is your servant that you should show regard for a dead dog such as I? Let's pause there for a second. There's two things going on here. First of all, if you ever took over a kingdom, oftentimes the first thing that the king would do would be to eliminate anybody who could challenge him for the rightful throne. And so in ancient times and even in medieval times, a king would come to the throne, however he came to the throne, and the first thing he would do would be to eliminate all the threats. And so the logical thing here for David to do, if he were a selfish king or a king just looking out for his own self-interest, would be to have Mephibosheth murdered, to take care of him so that no one can ever rightfully come against David for the throne of Israel. But the other thing is, here we go back into the box here from last episode in 1 Samuel. David made a promise to Saul. Let's look at chapter 24, verse 20. And now behold, I know that you shall surely be king. This is Saul talking. And that the kingdom of Israel shall be established by your hand. Swear to me, therefore, that by the Lord, that you will not cut off my offspring after me, and that you will not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David swore this to Saul. So, in addition to David not killing Mephibosheth, he is honoring his promise to Saul, and he's honoring his friend Jonathan by giving land and honor to Mephibosheth. So this is somebody who not only David probably should have killed by the measure of any other kingdom, but Mephibosheth, being a cripple, would be a social outcast as well. And David goes above and beyond his promise to Saul, not only not to cut them off, but he gives him Saul's land, and he honors him by having him sit at his table. That Mephibosheth is being almost grafted into David's family, because Jonathan, he looked on as a brother. Let's move on to verse 9. Then the king called Ziba, Saul's servant, and said to him, All that belonged to Saul and to all his house I have given to your master's grandson. And you and your sons and your servants shall till the land for him, and shall bring in the produce, that your master's grandson may have bread to eat. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall always eat at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. Then Ziba said to the king, According to all that my lord the king commands his servant, so your servant will do. So Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. Moving on to this third section. So then David engages in a battle with Ammon and Syria, a couple of their neighbors, and this is a long, extended battle that takes place over many seasons. And one winter, David goes home, and as he sends the men out for the spring campaign, often soldiers wouldn't fight during the winter often because it was too cold, and so they would hold until the spring. And so David, this next spring, sends out the army for their spring campaign, and we get to chapter 11. Let's look at verse 1. In the spring of the year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. I just pause right there for real quick. We'll stop at verse 2 for a second. So it says David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof. So for us, that seems kind of odd. Most of us don't go out and walk on our roofs. But for Israelites, they didn't have air conditioning, right? And so let's look at the house, the typical Israelite home here on the left. And so what you would have in a typical home is that you would have a courtyard downstairs. A lot of times, this would include livestock, would be in your house, and you would walk through the courtyard where you would have your livestock and things, and you would go back to the main part of the house in the back. And there was also ladders, uh, sometimes inside and sometimes outside to get to your second story if you have a second story, or to your roof, and both of those things. So if you have a second story, you'd have a ladder to get to the second story and a ladder to get to the roof, and oftentimes there would be an exterior ladder to get to the roof. But because they didn't have great ventilation in these houses, uh, they could only build small windows because they didn't want it to get too cold in the winter. And so the roof would be an area for working and for cooling off. You get a breeze on the roof that wouldn't flow through the house. So a lot of times they would sleep up there at night during the warm seasons, but they'd also do work up there and they'd bathe up there and those kind of things because it was comfortable. Um, and so you would have a lot of times areas on a roof where you would bathe, and you would get a fair amount of privacy up there, because most of the houses were about the same size. And so uh, you wouldn't be able to see down into someone else's privacy on the roof. But for David, being in his large estate, uh, it was probably taller, and so he could look down onto other people's roofs and see what was happening. And so that's what happened here. David leaves his couch and walks around on the roof, probably trying to get a breeze and enjoy the cooler temperature outside. And as he does so, he looks down and he sees a woman bathing on a nearby house. Back to verse 3. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So David sent messengers to her, and she came to him, and he lay with her. Now she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. We'll come back to that in a second. Then she returned to her house, and the woman conceived and sent and told David, "I am pregnant." So let's look back at the sentence here that's highlighted. It says she had been purifying herself from her uncleanness. And so Bathsheba purifying herself, which she has to do by law, uh, uh, really communicates to us a couple things. Number one, that she had just finished her menstrual cycle recently. And so when a woman was in menstruation or just coming out of menstruation, she had to wait so long before she could be ceremonially clean to enter into the temple, or into near the tabernacle, into the courtyard. She had to be ceremonially clean for those things to happen. And part of that ritual of making yourself ceremonially clean is that once your time of bleeding is over, you have to wait so long, and then you go and wash in water. So it tells us that she was coming off of her period. She was purifying herself, cleaning herself. But it also tells us that she's not pregnant. She's not pregnant when she goes to meet with David. And so when she does uh, show up pregnant, it tells us exactly what's happened, that this is David's child that she's carrying. One other thing here I put in the box, if she just has recently finished her menstruation, she's also likely beginning ovulation. So it kind of foreshadows a little bit what's going to happen here in verse 5. So let's get back to verse 5. And the woman conceived, and she sent to David and said, I am pregnant. So David sent word to Joab, send me Uriah the Hittite. And Joab sent Uriah to David. When Uriah came to him, David asked how Joab was doing and how the people were doing and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and wash your feet. And Uriah went out from the king's house, and there followed him a present from the king. But Uriah slept at the door of the king's house with all the servants of his lord, and did not go to his house. When they told David Uriah did not go down to his house, David said to Uriah, have you not come from a long journey? Why did you not go down to your house? Uriah said to David, the ark and Israel and Judah dwell in booths or in tents, and my lord Joab and the servants of my lord are camping in the open field. Shall I then go down to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife? As you live and as your soul lives, I will not do this thing. So Uriah is telling the king that it's not fair for me to go and live my normal life when my fellow servants, my fellow soldiers are out stuck in the field. And so he's showing David that he is a righteous man. And so David's first chance to kind of trick Uriah into thinking that this is his child goes awry. And so then we get to verse 12. Then David said to Uriah, remain here today also, and tomorrow I will send you back. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day and the next. And David invited him, and David invited him, and he ate in his presence and drank, so that he made him drunk. And in the evening he went out to lie on the couch with the servants of the Lord, but he did not go down to his house. So again, David tries again. Now this time he gets him drunk and tries to send him home. But Uriah, being the righteous man that he is, decides to stay in the king's house or in front of the king's house and won't go to his house because he doesn't believe it's fair to his fellow men who are out fighting in the field. Get down to verse 14. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. In the letter he wrote, send Uriah to the forefront of the hardest fighting, and then draw back from him that he may be struck down and die. And as Joab was besieging the city, he assigned Uriah to the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city came out and fought with Joab, and some of the servants of David among the people fell. Uriah the Hittite also died. So David, in trying to cover up his sin, has now done multiple things to try to trick Uriah into going back to his house so that he would think that he slept with his wife and conceived, and then she had a baby while he was out on campaign. That was his. And when that didn't work, David just decides, in order to continue covering up his sin, that he's just going to have Uriah killed. Verse 18. Then Joab sent and told David all the news about the fighting. And he instructed the messenger, when you have finished telling all the news about the king, or about the fighting to the king, then if the king's anger rises, if he says to you, why did you go so near the city to fight? Did you not know that they would shoot from the wall? Who killed Abimelech, the son of Jerubbesheth? Did not a woman cast an upper millstone on him from the wall, so that he died at Thebez? Why did you go so near the wall? Then you shall say, your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. So the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him to tell. The messenger said to David, the men gained an advantage over us and came out against us in the field, but we drove them back to the entrance of the gate. Then the archers shot at your servants from the wall. Some of the king's servants are dead, and your servant Uriah the Hittite is dead also. David said to the messenger, thus you shall say to Joab, do not let this matter displease you, for the sword devours now one and now another. Strengthen your attack against the city and overthrow it, and encourage him. When the wife Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she lamented over her husband. And when the mourning was over, David sent and brought her to his house, and she became his wife and bore him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Should be. So then David, he's gone through all this work to try to hide his sin from everybody. But God reveals his sin to the prophet Nathan. And so Nathan shows up as God tells him and rebukes David. And because of the sin and of David trying to hide the sin, God strikes his newborn son dead. Later on, again, Bathsheba conceives and they give birth to a son named Solomon. And then we have chaos that begins to happen throughout David's family. So all this is ripple effects of David's sin. And so we see that David's son Amnon begins lusting after his half-sister Tamar, and even so far that he goes to tricking her into coming to his house, and he rapes her and he tosses her aside like garbage. And Absalom, who's Tamar's full brother, so he's then Amnon's half brother, is enraged, and he goes and sets up a plan and he murders Amnon. And then he flees Jerusalem for 3 years because he's afraid of David's wrath. David eventually forgives Absalom and he returns to Jerusalem, but Absalom, his mind has become evil, and so he begins conspiring and growing strong by building alliances with the elders in Jerusalem, the elders of Israel, and building himself some powerful men around him. And so as the conspiracy grows close, David and his family end up fleeing Jerusalem. And so even then, Mephibosheth turns against David, which is an interesting turn of events after David had done so much for him. But from there, we see that Absalom goes and he lays with David's concubines that are still in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is, David has left Jerusalem with his family, but he's left some of his concubines behind. And the Absalom has a very bad advisor, and this advisor tells Absalom to go and put a tent out on the roof and to lay with all David's concubines. And so in doing so, he's really claiming the kingship for himself. So let's look at the box here on the left. So the taking of a leader's wife or a concubine was seen not only as an insult, but as one who is usurping the power of a leader. And so for Absalom to do this, to take his father's concubines, he was claiming the throne for himself. So this is domination that's seen often in the animal kingdom. We see it sometimes with warring tribal communities where there's one dominant male. So think of lions, for instance. There's one dominant male, and that stays the same until a new male comes in and dominates that male, and then that male becomes the dominant male. So that's what Absalom is doing here. He's claiming in front of everybody, in full view of the public on the roof. He's set up tents to let them know that he's in charge, that he is the new king, and that anyone who wants to challenge him needs to come out now, because he is going to rule Israel. But even though Absalom has his wicked advisor, David's friend Hushai, stays on and offers Absalom contradictory counsel. So we have a wicked advisor, and we have another advisor who's loyal to David. He's a good advisor, but he offers Absalom some contradictory counsel in order to allow David to escape and to avoid slaughter. And so Hushai really helps liberate David and to make safe the kingdom for the time being. And so while Absalom has the backing of elders, he thinks he's strong. He's building this uh, cohort of strong, powerful people around him. The army actually is still loyal to David. And so the army comes and assembles in loyalty to David, and they go at David's command and recapture the city. And Joab himself ends up killing Absalom. So now David's back in the city, and you would think, once again, that David would just kill all the people that were disloyal to him, but David ends up pardoning those who conspired against him, and in actuality is uh, really, really grieved at the death of Absalom. He was hoping that they could end it without Absalom being killed, but Joab decided to kill him anyway. Then we get to the epilogue, and it's thus named. These are things here in the epilogue that don't really happen in chronological order. They're kind of a mishmash of things that have happened during David's tenure as king. They kind of get lumped together here at the end of the book. And so for 3 years, there's famine in the land. David seeks after Yahweh, and God tells him to go and avenge the Gibeonites who were wronged by Saul. The people of Israel had made a vow to the Gibeonites, and Saul had broken that vow and had wronged the Gibeonites. And so David goes and he does what God tells him to do to avenge the Gibeonites, and so God ends the famine. There's a story about David and his men going and killing the last of the giants of the Philistines. So we talked about Goliath and the giants and the offspring of the Nephilim. So here in this story, David and his men go and they kill the last of the giants of the Philistines. David praises God for his deliverance, going back to his time being delivered from Saul. There's a psalm in there about David praising God for that deliverance. David prophesies about his everlasting house. Look at chapter 23, verse 5. For does not my house stand so with God? For he has made with me an everlasting covenant, ordered in all things and secure. For will he not cause to prosper all my help and my desire? We then learn about David's mighty men. These are his men of renown, the men who are his fighting men, his warriors, the men who fight alongside Joab and are known, just as David once was, of killing many, many enemies all by themselves. And so we learn a little bit about them. And then to close out the chapter, we see a little bit about some issues that we're having. So Israel, again, even with the king that God desired. So we had the king that the people desired, that God gave them because he knew they would follow. And now now they have the king that God desired, the one that God chose because he was the right man for the job. Even though he's a flawed man, God had chose David for that purpose. And yet Israel is still continuing to turn away from Yahweh. And so we see here in the chapter that Yahweh incites David against them, and he orders a census to be done. And so then David and the people are punished with pestilence, and God ends up bringing a pestilence on the people, and 70,000 people die. And then David finishes by doing what God has told him, and he builds an altar and he prays, and God ends the pestilence and brings back peace to the nation. There's one interesting thing of note here in 2 Samuel chapter 24. It specifically says that Yahweh incites David against the people, and that he goes and orders a census to be done. But we see the same story told in 1 Chronicles 21. Here in the box on the left, you'll see it. It actually says that Satan, what we know as Satan, stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. So how can both Yahweh and Satan incite David into doing something? And we really remedy this by understanding what Satan is. So we talked about this a little bit back in Genesis, and we'll talk about it more throughout the Old Testament, but especially when we get to the book of Job. In the Old Testament, Satan is not a figure. Satan isn't a singular enemy figure. He's not God's arch enemy. In the Old Testament, there's no evidence for that. What we really see is the word Satan, which is the adversary or the enemy. And so this adversary shows up throughout the Old Testament, but until the time of the Second Temple period, which is just before, actually during Jesus's time and before that, Satan hasn't really become a singular figure seen as the archenemy of God. In the Old Testament, he was just known as Satan, or as the adversary. And so the adversary's job, which we'll learn more about in Job, is really to go and to test people on earth. His job is to go and prod and see if people are wicked or if people are righteous, and what they're going to do. And so by understanding how that Satan figure works, we then can understand this. And so the apparent contradiction is remedied by understanding Satan as that adversary character. And when we look at it in connection with Job, where God allows that adversary character to test Job by attacking him, then we come to the conclusion that God either allowed the Satan to incite David, or that God instructed Satan to incite David. There's a note here from the ESV Study Bible. It says, God himself never does evil, but sometimes he uses evil moral agents to accomplish his purposes. Okay, so where we want to just leave this off at is that the Satan is a celestial being, but it has a purpose. The Satan is its job title. It's the adversary, and so it goes around and it tests the people of earth, the humans. And so I hope that helps you understand that a little bit more. If you have questions, let me know on that. But that kind of wraps up the episode there. So again, if you have any questions, please let us know. We're going to continue a little bit more of David's story, actually in the next several weeks. But we'll kind of come to the end of his story next week when we get to 1 Kings. If you have any questions, please let us know. Comment down below, and we'd love to answer. Good to have this time with you tonight. Have a great night.